us, and he'll join us here. I do want to remind you that there is a very rich website for this course that's available to you. John and our staff put it together every week. It has readings on it. It has YouTube videos. You can watch this all over again tomorrow if you want to see it, or any of the earlier ones. You can get there if you just look up policyschool.neu.edu and click on Open Classroom, and you'll get all this information here. Let me just raise one more issue, which is really quite interesting, and then I want to open it up to your questions. I was recently asked to join the bipartisan commission in Washington, which is now looking not just at deficit reduction, but looking at the whole question of healthcare. The Deficit Reduction Commission, which was chaired by Alice Rivlin and former Senator Pete Domenici, basically came to the conclusion that we have to do something about the federal deficit, but also came to the conclusion that if you don't do much about healthcare, you can't do much about the deficit. And part of the answer, as I've been learning this field with my friends in Bouvet College and in medical schools around the country, is how do we change the healthcare delivery system? And a lot of that has to do with how do we change the nature of the workforce in healthcare and providing new roles. And many of those roles, I think, are going to be ones that we see in Encore Careers, as Phyllis showed in some of her slides. How do we keep people healthier and in doing healthier lifestyles, which may provide us some relief, at least in the short run, on healthcare costs? Patient advocates, coaches, may be the kinds of jobs we're looking for. So this could be a very interesting issue, simply thinking about what are we going to do in terms of restructuring the healthcare system. But it's now time for your questions. We're open for them, and wait for John to come around with the mic. I'd like you to introduce yourself, and if you would, in 10 seconds, tell us what you're now doing. Martin?
My name is Martin Evans. I used to be a professor. I'm retired. I now do a lot of volunteering. My question is just about that. If people move into Encore Careers, what's that going to do to the supply of volunteers?
The reality is that in today's economy, with
John, can we move that?
John, just get close to this.
I've just raised it here.
okay, is this good? The future of the population who is able to volunteer without any kind of stipend for significant amount of time, it's going to be affected by a lot of variables, including for people after their primary careers, the extent to which they have the economic ability to live without earning an income. I think that there are lots of indications that is becoming more and more problematic. That's number one. Number two, anyone who is able to contribute to the common good on a sustained basis through a body of work, but doesn't need a paycheck, should be valued. We've all talked, the concept of the $1 a year man, the mayor of New York, is highly regarded, and there's no reason to erase that. I will say that while I'm emphasizing in the definition a paycheck plus social impact, it's largely to change the perception of what people will do during this time of their lives. If someone can afford to work pro bono in my profession, that's a highly respected way of working, then go for it, work pro bono. My third point is that people volunteer alongside of the work that they do for pay at all ages. They volunteer alongside of the schooling that they're going to at all ages. That needn't change. But I do think that organizations that are dependent upon a cohort of older adults who are able to volunteer significant amounts of time without pay will see a diminished supply of people available to do that.
Hi, my name is Evelyn Barahona. I just wanted to say thank you for your lecture. And this is a question for Phyllis. I noticed that when you were discussing how the Encore career people get back on track and they start doing things in terms of philanthropy and foundations, I found an interesting parallel of what you were saying, because I have a lot of friends between the ages of 20s and 30s that have been doing the same thing, and most of them have become social entrepreneurs. Is there any information that sort of creates that connection based on that information you gave?
Throughout our adulthood, the interest and desire to work on the common good can, and for many does, continue. I've worked in the social sector all of my life. The fact that I'm doing that now in an Encore career is it's not the first time that I have. So the first point to make is that you can dedicate yourself to a social purpose early in your adulthood and continue that on into an Encore career. On the point of being a social entrepreneur, there are people at all ages along the spectrum who are looking to discover and are creating new solutions to problems, creating programs and organizations. One of the things we've been doing with the social entrepreneurs in their 60s and older, the Wilson Goods and the Robert Chambers, is bringing them together with younger social entrepreneurs to learn from each other. There is a lot in this space which is multi-generational, how we can learn from and with each other. Is that responsive to what you were looking for? Thank you for raising that.
Hi, I'm Julia Geisman. I'm a consultant. I work with learning and development and organizational effectiveness, and do a lot of coaching and leadership. So that's one career that I know I can be doing my entire life. A comment about societal norms, and then a question to you, Joe. I find my blood curdling when the news reports elderly woman attacked in her own home. Okay, that's horrible. She's 62. Last night there was news coverage of a woman 70 years old in London, in England, who attacked some people who were, robbing a jewelry store, and they called her a granny, and she was 70 years old. So I mean, I find this to be, kind of insulting. So and it goes to your point, Phyllis, which is that we have to somehow change the perception. Now, Joe, the question I have for you is, we boomers have a great deal of vanity about getting old. And I wonder if there is some correlation between the drive to stay productive in the workforce and that sense of vanity.
That's one explanation I haven't heard. If you ask, I have another answer for you that I'll end with, but if you ask people who are still working on bridge jobs why they're doing it, you get these very dichotomous answers that correlate with the two groups I talked. Obviously it's not that clean, but at the upper socioeconomic status folks, you get all sorts of answers like, I like to feel productive, I need a reason to get up in the morning, I like my colleagues at work. A whole bunch of answers. If you sauteed them down, they're basically saying, because I want to, that's why. And at the other end of the folks that may be bagging your groceries at Star Market, who are in bridge jobs, they say, I need money to make ends meet, I need to pay, I need the medical coverage. A bunch of answers that if you sauteed them down, they're saying, because I have to. So I think both those answers are there. The hypothesis I've come up with, and I've never been able to get this published, is it's all due to Seinfeld. If you remember those episodes where Jerry visits his parents in Florida, and they go to dinner at 4:30 and they're in bed at 7:30, and they complain about their health and their children and their grandchildren, our generation is saying, not me. I'm not going to be Jerry's grandfather. I'm Jerry's father. I think that's the real reason.
But you know, to that point, I mean, there's that level of vanity in everybody I know, who, you know, my peer groups, that retirement sounds totally abominable to me in the traditional sense.
Correct. Yeah, no, I mean, again, people who live in Massachusetts aren't living in the heartlands, and you know, our voting patterns suggest you should look further than your neighbors to see what the world is like. But I don't know very many people whose dream is to move to a gated community in Florida and play 6 rounds of golf per week. I mean, I'd rather, well, we'll finish that, but I would not want to. But
Certainly
again,
not for 20 or 30 years.
no, particularly with my slice. But on the other hand, the other thing I want to make sure, when I give these talks, I tend to emphasize the importance of bridge jobs. But it isn't one size fit all. If 60% of the people are leaving the labor force via bridge jobs, 40% aren't. And those are the ones who work full-time, stop working, and never work for pay again. And my mother was one of those people. She had a fabulous job with the state of Maryland in the old WIN program, which some of you will remember. I mean, she really enjoyed her work. She got to 62 or 63, and she retired. And she did some volunteer work and so on, but she had no desire to go back to her work for pay, even though she, in fact, liked her work for pay. So, you know, different strokes for different folks. And the other thing I will say is one of the shortcomings of the research that I've done, and it's been brought up by these questions, is we're only counting people in bridge jobs who are actually working for pay, like most of Phyllis's jobs. But in addition to that, there's all sorts of older folks and younger folks who leave a career job and are extremely productive in society as non-paid volunteers. In our study, those aren't counted as bridge jobs. Those are treated exactly the same as the folks who are playing 6 rounds of golf in Florida, even though their contribution to society is quite different. But I don't begrudge people playing 6 rounds of golf in Florida if they want to. That's fine. Different folks do different things. But our research has said no matter how you define a bridge job and a career job, bridge jobs, gradual retirement, partial retirement, is a really important part of the story in America.
Thank you.
My name is Mel Langford. I'm in a sort of a semi-encore career. I used to be a CPA, now I'm a CPA financial planner. So that's sort of a semi-encore. The question I have is, when we started off this session, we had the Business Week article showed that there was 16.7% of the young people unemployed. And that raises the question of, if people are working longer, isn't that going to create a conflict between the people who are unemployed, the young people who can't get jobs, and the older people, the encore people, who are still working? And would you comment on that?
Are you asking that of me or Joe or both?
Joe.
Well, I'll start. Certainly in an economy like this, with 9% unemployment, it's hard to argue that there's no relationship between folks continuing to stay on, and the number of jobs available to folks in the beginning of their careers. We certainly find this in the academic world, where I have colleagues who are teaching in their 80s, some of whom are still terrific, some of them shouldn't be teaching, but when they retire, that's a tenure track job for some new professor. My wife, whom I've already mentioned, is a public sector lawyer for many, many years, and they're finding what people used to do is go out and become a public defender or a district attorney assistant for several years, get all sorts of fabulous experience, and then move to a law firm, opening up jobs for the next generation of folks who want to get some law experience. Well, she's finding with her students in Suffolk Law now that the folks aren't leaving after 2 or 3 years. They're staying in these jobs, and therefore it's really jammed up for her current students who are coming out. On the other hand, I would also follow that up by saying, I mean, really, this is what macroeconomists are supposed to be doing. I mean, we should be living in a world, hard to do, I admit, in which people who want jobs can find them. And I don't really think it's fair to say to potential encore careers, it's unfair or immoral or unjust for you to do this because the macroeconomy is in such rotten shape that we've got 9% unemployment. So I do acknowledge a relationship, but I'm not quite sure what the public policy implication should be.
Barry, let me ask you to comment on from the research you did about the jobs prospects in the not too distant future, because we are in a between a rock and a hard place right now. I agree with Joe that the pitting of generations against each other is not a fair conversation. But the point of the bottom line here is that to grow our economy and to meet our community's needs, we need people of all ages in the workforce.
We did a study, as I mentioned, for Civic Ventures, in which we projected out, not from today, but into the future, and the result was something that got covered in something like 600 different magazines and newspapers, because it was kind of like a man bites dog story. Here we have at the time, a 9.7% unemployment rate, and we were saying, if we can wait a little while, admittedly 2018, we're going to have possibly the opposite problem because of the aging of the population. I just so happened to be in Connecticut the other day, and last week with Governor Patrick in the Commonwealth Summit, and I laid out some new numbers that have come out of the Office of Management and Budget, which is a cabinet office in the President Obama's OMB. And what they project is a growth in the economy that picks up in 2011. In fact, they're projecting a growth of GDP of about 4.2% in 2012 and 2013, and that finally gets us growing jobs fairly rapidly, so that by 2014, admittedly still 3 years away from now, we're down around 6% unemployment. And thereafter, unless some horrible thing happens, we get down to unemployment rates around 5%. That's probably close to full employment, and that's probably the kind of unemployment rate that will mean that there will be jobs for older people, there will be jobs for younger people, and you also have to realize there's an enormous amount of turnover in the economy. So even though you might only have a net increase in the number of jobs of, let's say, 1 million, you're actually opening up 3 or 4 million new openings per year. So there will be a lot of openings. The real question, I think, is not going to be whether young people are competing with old people. The question is whether we're going to have an education and training system that will provide young people with the kind of education and training that will allow them to take those jobs. Just here in Massachusetts, last point, we did a major study on manufacturing, which I think we reported on in an earlier open classroom, in which we interviewed over 700 manufacturer CEOs, owner managers. And we also did a lot of analysis of data trying to project out in the future. Despite the fact that we will continue to see an overall but very slowly declining total employment in manufacturing between now and 2025, we actually projected an increase of about 10,000 openings each year as a result of retirements. And manufacturing is the kind of thing where people actually don't want to be still working in manufacturing when they're 70 years old. So there are going to be jobs opening up, and in fact they're starting to open up now despite an 8.2% unemployment rate in Massachusetts. And some of the manufacturers are now telling us they're having some trouble filling some of those jobs already with young people. So it's a little more complicated, and we need to do that.
Okay. Hi. Oh, good Lord. Sorry, I'm used to being loud. My name is Michelle. I'm a second-year undergrad at Northeastern on co-op in international education. And I've really enjoyed being in this discussion and watching you guys bring up the issues of vanity and age and perception. I actually just got out of a study abroad intensive where I worked 20 hours a week at AHECO, Asociación Geroglífica de Costarricense, which is roughly the Geriatric Association of Costa Rica. And I also did an intensive grant process with them, where we did a lot of discussion of perception of age and the concept they call la segunda edad, which is the second life, the second age. And I grew up with Venezuelan family, and I always called my abuelitas viejas, the old ladies. And when I went to Costa Rica and I was working in Ajico, they got incredibly offended when I called them las viejas and los viejos. And they preferred to be called los adultos mayores, the older people, or personas de la segunda edad, because they, at Ajico in particular, are spending so much time remarketing this second life, this second age, that it's become an issue of contention to them, to the point where they don't necessarily just get upset or just pass it on. They will just be like, no, my little friend. That's what they called us. And just explain it to us in a very wonderful way. And I thought it was great working at Ajico because there were only 3 college students. We were the youngest people working in the organization that works for the entire country. Everyone who worked there was a senior citizen, was an adulta mayor. And it was, I think the youngest person who worked there full time was having her 3rd child. So she was in her 30s. And they had really repackaged being old, growing older. And they ran all of their workshops. They ran all of their classifieds. They ran a newspaper, a library, classrooms, learning how to be a homestay parent. They were all doing this, and they were all senior citizens in Costa Rica.
All the way back at the top.
Hi, my name is Julie Proof. I'm a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And my question is regarding, these are, looked at a lot of national trends over the past 2 hours. I'm wondering if there are any regional differences across the country in terms of thinking about encore careers or thinking about people staying longer, working longer in the labor force.
There are differences across the country in the state of the movement. I'll use that term. The state of identifying and enabling encore careers, and that's because there are some differences in the demographics in different states, but the demographic bulge of boomers moving into their 60s and beyond, and the longevity of life cuts across the nation. So I don't think that there are regional differences in the trend of where we're going. But it's an interesting question to look at. We could use a graduate student to study it. I think that'd be a great project for you to take on.
If I could just add, I mean, one of the things, and this is picking up on what Phyllis said, maybe Joe has a comment on it. Different parts of the country are aging at very different rates. In fact, I used these numbers earlier today in Holyoke. If you go out to the year 2020, and you're doing a projection using official census data from 2010 to 2020, you'll find that nationwide, about 99% of the net additional population, net growth in population, about 99% will be 55 and over, and about 2/3 of them will be over 65. We looked at some of those numbers, I think, on the very first open classroom, and that's the pig and the python. That's our baby boomers aging. Here in Massachusetts, it's 135%. We're actually going to see a decline in the total number of people under 55, between 18 and 55. We're just looking at adults. In Connecticut, where I was last week with the new governor, it's 149%. In Arizona, although this is before the collapse of their economy, it's only about 83%. So the aging of the population is moving. And a lot of that has to do with both immigration trends, places like Arizona, except they now have laws that make it difficult to do that there, and has to do with net domestic migration, the rate at which people are leaving certain states and moving to other states versus the other way around. So there's certainly going to be some significant differences, at least if you trust the census projections on that issue. Joe, do you know anything more about that?
No, but there's a couple other questions up there.
Good.
My name is Mary Kay Brown, and I'm working on older worker policy development for the Secretary of Elder Affairs here in Massachusetts. So this is a question for Joe and Barry, familiar with your work. Often bridge careers, as I understand it, are a choice by someone because often their current employers are not as flexible as perhaps they could be, or maybe will need to be as we move forward. Employers, it seems to me, need to do a better job of making those jobs appealing to stay, to retain their qualified workers. Because of your long work in this research area, your connection with the business community, I'd love to know your insights as to where do you think our employer community is here now in terms of getting the message about the need to be flexible and committing to it, and how better off do you think we might be in 5 or 10 years?
Yeah. I must say, I tend to tell a kind of optimistic story that I think these changes that we're observing are mostly good things. But I must say, the area of the story that makes me a little nervous is exactly that. It's the behavior of firms. And again, I think this is something that is very much related to the macroeconomy. If you had a 4% unemployment rate now, believe me, firms would find ways to be flexible for folks whom they wanted to keep. In a 9% unemployment world, it's less important to do that. In our research, when we find all these bridge jobs, what we almost never find is someone in their same position dropping to part-time. Almost all these folks that are moving to bridge jobs are changing employers in order to do so. Now, on the one hand, that's unfortunate because your specific human capital, your training, is obviously in this line of work, in this firm, why not continue? On the other hand, many people said, and Barry mentioned people in the manufacturing industry, someone on the assembly line in Detroit, or Tennessee more likely, many people actually want to change the nature of work, want to change where they live and work, and so on. So I do, it's not something I've studied as much. I've studied more the labor supply side, what folks want to do. But the labor demand side, which is actually much harder to study because there aren't these wonderful government surveys that hand me 12,000 people to follow for 20 years. It really is a concern, and I think it's a legitimate concern.
I would just add and reinforce Joe's point. I mean, from the point of view of workers, there's nothing better than a 4% unemployment rate. It changes all kinds of behavior on the part of firms. We're already seeing, however, because of these spot shortages in manufacturing, and I'm just looking at one sector, that in fact firms are begging their really skilled labor to stay on and trying to find ways to give them the opportunity to do that because they're worried that they can't replace these highly skilled, not necessarily highly educated in the conventional sense, but very highly skilled workers who know how to turn metal and extrude plastic, and they are not sure that they have a young workforce that they could instantly hire to fill those positions. That may be happening in some other fields, in nursing and so forth, where there is going to be the attempt to restructure jobs in order to keep valued employees. But as the unemployment rate falls, this problem will become a lot less difficult.
One other issue is less so now with defined contribution plans, but in a world of defined benefit plans, where sometimes your pension is based on your last 3 years of earnings. The last thing you want is to have 3 years of part-time earnings on which your whole pension future is based. In Social Security, of course, you can work halfish and get part of your benefit. Generally, with private pensions, defined benefit pensions, you can't do that. You have to leave the firm in order to collect your benefit. You can't collect half your benefit and work half your job. So some of it is structural things like that, which of course could be changed.
My name's Brian Schoen. I'm a graduate student over at the Heller School at Brandeis, and I was very struck during Phyllis' talk at just how service-oriented a lot of the clusters of Encore careers are. And it got me wondering where the tension between young people and old people is actually coming from. And I was wondering, Professor Quinn, if any of the data is suggesting that these two generations are really actually competing for a lot of the same jobs, or if it's more like what we were just talking about, or what we were hearing about manufacturing, where there's the perception of this tension, but in fact, we're not really.
Yeah, now again, I've studied hardly at all youth. It's not something I know much about. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that a young person is directly competing with Z, a person who's contemplating retirement. If Z leaves, a number of people could move up the line, creating an opening at the beginning. For instance, in my world, the kind of people who are leaving are likely to be full professors who've been there for a long time. That opens up often a job for a brand new PhD, an assistant professor, so they're not specifically stepping into the details of the person who retired's job, but it shuffles along the way. But honestly, it's not something I know a whole lot about, the youth labor market.
He actually studies 2 children, his own. I know this because we're good friends.
Well, a friend of mine who, like me, is getting on in years and studies these issues says, as we age, research becomes me-search.
Hi, my name is Charles Oberlsky. I'm 53, unemployed, and I work in the nonprofit world. So one of the things is I'm encouraged by the idea of that there will be the opportunity you can work your labor, and I think that's just good. But I am nervous about the have to work side, and again, maybe this is my research, but I really get how expensive I am. You know, I have a family, so I need a family health plan. You know, and I see what happens with nonprofits hitting that. Oh no, the 30-hour mark. Under that, it's health is so that there's what kind of benefits. You know, what happened to my own retirement account? I don't have a defined. I mean, it's all what I saved, and then took a big 30% whack. Essentially, meaning that what I had at age in my early 40s is what I have today. So that there's a bit of this. It's also incredibly unnerving for me as well. That it's hard to leave. I can feel optimistic about having to work, but are these jobs going to pay anything? Do I need to be subsidized somehow by a spouse who has a health plan, or somebody else has to work, or do I need an inheritance? I mean, there's a bunch of things that are. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. You get the idea.
I think you need to choose new parents.
But you do mention one thing, and this is not going to be applicable in your current circumstance, but it is a longer view of what looking at our life and work trajectory will be like, could have as an implication. In the past, people saved for retirement to support a period of time when they didn't have to work they didn't have to earn an income. What if instead we were saving during our early career and mid-career to be able to subsidize the ability to do work from which we were deriving an income but less income? We were self-subsidizing. And it's a different picture of saving for later life than saving for a life of golf. But you could see how that would begin to reshape the life's plan.
But that all assumes that you're employed during those years when you want to be employed.
Yes.
And of course, we've now got 9% of the population, which vastly understates the problem, I'm sure, who aren't. But when we compare, and we've done this in our research, when we've compared the nature of the career job that someone had and the nature of the bridge job that they moved to, along a whole bunch of dimensions, they look like lousier jobs in the sense that they pay less per hour, they're less likely to have benefits like pensions and health and so on and so forth. And in many cases that's unfortunate, but of course in some cases this is a trade-off that people are willing to make. They may be someone who's over 65, so at least they're covered by Medicare. And what they're getting instead of the higher pay and the higher benefits is the kind of flexibility, hours per week, weeks per year, and so on, that they couldn't get on their career job. So sometimes people are voluntarily moving to what by our measures, look like lousier jobs. Of course, Phyllis would certainly point out those aren't necessarily the appropriate dimensions to define a lousy versus a good job. These jobs could be extremely rewarding, fulfilling, just like volunteer work, which of course in my world looks like the lousiest of jobs. They're not even paying you, but of course they can be extraordinarily fulfilling.
I think we have time for maybe one or two quick questions. Anyone?
Nobody wants to be last.
Well, then I want to thank Phyllis Siegel and Joseph Fink for we will see you next Wednesday night, 6 o'clock, snow willing. Take care. Thanks for coming.